conflicts resulting from traveling restrictions and immigration. Part of the series Global Business Law in 20 Minutes with Federico Vasoli. That is our topic for today.
Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by instantmediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent.
Hello and welcome in our next episode of the series that we are recording with Federico Vasoli. I'm Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
And hi, I'm Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout the states of Florida and Texas.
And hi, I'm Federico Vasoli, Italian lawyer with offices in Malta, Singapore, and Vietnam.
Federico, after our last episode, when you were describing the trends that you perceived in the global economy, concentrating on Malta, Singapore, and Vietnam in 2021, I think this is time when we need to concentrate on some specific issues. And we thought that we should be more specific in terms of how things connected with the travel restrictions and immigration can result in conflicts in people's personal lives and businesses. And can you give us an example of how important it might get in people's lives?
Thank you, Natalia. Yes, absolutely. You're opening a Pandora box here. But look, with COVID, governments implemented unprecedented restrictions to traveling, not just to foreigners, but also to their own residents and citizens. An example that I give often, because it happened to us, is that of a foreigner that legally resides in Singapore, that for very serious personal reasons had to leave Singapore, go to Europe during the pandemic. And while he was away for very serious reasons, the government of Singapore changed the law instantly, giving a 24-hour notice. Of course, they didn't send him a push notification. It was just out there in the news. And he and we, as his advisors, found out that he was not allowed to re-enter Singapore because he was a foreigner, even though he was legally resident in Singapore. And legally residing in Singapore means that you have your family in Singapore, your house, if you have children, you have your children, their schools, your business, your workplace, your office, even if you don't go there because there is a lockdown, but you have everything there, your objects, etc. You might be super wealthy and have a lot of homes around the world, a country house, a seaside house and whatnot, but still, that is your home, that is where you live, that is where your life is organized, and you just get this information from the government that in 24 hours, sorry, borders closed even to foreign residents. But there is worse. There are countries like, including democracies, including Western democracies like Australia and probably also New Zealand, but I don't want to be wrong here, that even closed the borders temporarily to their own citizens. People holding an Australian passport were not allowed, let alone all the others, of course, to enter Australia during the pandemic from certain high-risk countries. So if you were unlucky enough to transit through India during the outbreak of the Delta variant there and be an Australian citizen that needed to go back to his home country, Australia, you could not due to the prevailing necessity of protecting public health. If you were in India, you could not go back to Australia. Of course, it is different whether you live in India and you happen to be an Australian citizen, or you're temporarily passing through India and then you need to go back. But still, these restrictions were massive and they caused a lot of disruptions. You can imagine family issues, you can imagine business issues. You want to meet your business partners, you want to see an investment site, you want to see a location. You want to stay close to your dear ones, and in a globalized world, maybe you have your spouse with you in the place where you live, but your parents somewhere else, your children somewhere else again. So all these restrictions created at least tensions, if not conflicts, indeed.
And having said that, that creates conflict. So the first question of a conflict resolution person like me and Mac are is how you resolve this conflict. And second, whether this conflict gives any ground for damages. And I would like to start with the second part. Do you perceive that the person that was deprived from their family life, from their regular income because they actually run a business there, can they have any claim for damages, and if yes, against whom?
That is a great question, Natalia, and I'm afraid I'm not able to give you a straight answer. Probably the answer is no, because there are prevailing necessities, prevailing needs, prevailing objectives that as a community are stronger than individual rights. So, for instance, in Singapore, I'll give you the example of Singapore because I was based there. As you know, having an office there, I remained in Singapore throughout the most difficult months of the pandemic early in 2020. I remained there for about 7 months, stranded in Singapore. At a certain point in time, I think it was March, April 2020, the Singaporean government said, look, you are allowed to exit Singapore, but bear in mind that if you come back and you test positive for COVID-19, you will have to pay hospitalization fees. And they're not exactly cheap in Singapore, but they warned you in advance. Of course, it was a disincentive to traveling. Now, here we have to be a bit philosophical. There's a fine line between protecting individual rights, which could also be the rights of exploring new ventures, new businesses. It's not just leisure. It's not about, okay, I have some free time in my hands. I'll explore the world in the midst of a pandemic. And the need to, the pressing need to protect a community of peers where everybody's equal. And why does my selfish interest of making business somewhere else have to endanger my peers in my community after bringing the virus from outside? This is the argumentation that would be used by those supporting the implementation of these measures, and probably would be used by judges in not awarding damages. But the counterparty would likely be the government for implementing or for how they implemented certain measures. That is, yes, we may accept the measures, but perhaps they were implemented too abruptly. This could be ground for discussion, but you would need a constitutional lawyer likely to discuss these things. I'm thinking about similar topics, not related to COVID, that have to do with taxation in Italy, for instance, and they were resolved in this way. That is, the greatest interest of the community prevails over the interest of the individual. So then you had a question about how to resolve the question, the actual concrete problem that we face with this gentleman. In this specific case, but I know that it is a solution that was used with other people. Initially, we didn't think about a solution. Initially, we thought, well, this situation will pass, so he can wait. Let's wait and see. But when the wait became too long, and there were tax consequences that might be looming, that is, if you remain in a place for usually over 3 months, first of all, you need to register there, typically. And secondly, you're likely to become a taxpayer in that country. When those things were about to manifest, then we thought, no, we need to find a solution. First of all, he was lucky enough to be A, wealthy, and B, flexible with his business. But imagine he was a normal person with a normal job, an employee that got stuck in a foreign country for so long. Likely the employer would have said, bye-bye, you left the country, I sack you. So we're already in a privileged position with this man. So the solution that we found was the digital nomad program, the digital nomad visa program, sorry. In this case of the Emirates, of the United Arab Emirates in Dubai. There are similar programs. So what we did was, thanks to the fact that he met all the requirements set by the law in the Emirates for staying there according to this program, which, as the term says, allows foreigners to settle in Dubai, in the Emirates, without taking up employment or without being married to locals or to people residing there. Then, yes, we applied for that, and it was successful. And eventually we did something very similar with Bali in Indonesia. Why Bali in Indonesia? Because in this specific case, Indonesia is on the same time zone as Singapore. So first of all, it was closer to his family, and secondly, it would be easier for him to manage his business in Singapore. So that was the solution that we found.
Thank you. And Federico, let's take a step back, or I guess have a forest view of this. Before we started recording, we were having a chit chat backstage about different ways governments have approached COVID restrictions and traveling and immigration. How do you contrast the way some of the Western countries have handled traveling and immigration issues during the pandemic versus some of the Asian countries, specifically the Asian countries that you've lived in?
The difference is that Europe, at least, and most likely the entire Western world, with the exclusion of Australia and New Zealand, has relaxed and tightened measures from time to time, depending on how the pandemic waves were hitting. So even now, yes, there are tighter restrictions in Europe. Malta, for instance, is adopting a similar certificate as the one that represents somehow the gold standard in Europe, which is the Italian so-called Green Pass, that essentially is a QR code that shows that you are vaccinated or tested negative. But even now, at the time of speaking, with the Omicron variant ramping, we do not see the same level of restrictions that we experienced in 2020 with lockdowns, with border controls, with border closure effectively, etc. Yes, we see a lot of flight cancellations. So de facto, it means that even if you are allowed legally to travel, then good luck finding a flight or a hotel room. But that is a different story. But it's still, it matters, because even if you're allowed to do something, if you don't have the means to do it, or the costs. I remember back in 2020, I was looking for flights back from Singapore to Europe, and of course, all flights to Italy had been cancelled. Of course, there has never been a direct flight from Singapore to Malta. So I would go back to any other major hub in Europe and then would fly from there to Malta. And I found, I remember, a direct flight, economy class, one way to, I think it was Paris or Frankfurt, for $7,000 Singapore dollars, which is roughly 5,000 US dollars, something like that, which is out of this world. So even if you're allowed to, yet you have to face some concrete difficulties. Asia, on the other hand, never really relaxed the measures. Singapore did recently, so let's praise Singapore for once, and being probably too harsh against a country which represents the quintessence of efficiency, really. Singapore, back in October, opened the so-called VTLs, vaccinated travel lanes. So if you show a valid vaccination certificate, which is recognized by Singapore, I think that Singapore only recognizes 2 or 3 of all the vaccines that are out there that have been permitted by the World Health Organization. Then you can fly directly to Singapore without having to quarantine. But the hassle is that you need to get tested every single day. And you have to upload the results of the test on a dedicated website. 3 out of the 7 tests are performed by local nurses because they are PCR tests. The others are the home kits that you do at home, and you just upload the results on the website. So there is, or at least there was, a lot of tracing in Singapore, which we do not have in Europe. And that is exactly what happened in December with the Omicron variant in countries like Italy, that saw the numbers spiking simply because people started to get tested. People had the vaccination certificates and said, well, I'm protected, or who cares? Then with Christmas coming and family gatherings coming and numbers worsening, people said, wait a second, I might as well get tested. Oops, I'm positive without symptoms. So the difference is tracing. In Asia, it is much more pervasive. And the fact that traveling restrictions have not really been lifted, which is a hassle also for families. If you have a spouse here, maybe with a passport that doesn't allow to travel to other countries. This is a general topic. Passports, it doesn't really have to do with COVID. But can you stay? This is also, I'm thinking out loud when I'm speaking. You are a Vietnamese passport holder. You are stuck in Europe with your husband, with your wife, who's European and enjoys freedom of settlement in Europe, regardless of where he or she lives. But can you? Well, you can apply for a residency permit in an EU country, And it is your right to obtain a permit because your spouse is an EU resident or a EU citizen even. So that's fine. But you need to apply. If you don't, you're staying illegally in that country after a certain amount of time, which usually is 90 days overall combined over 180 days. So what happens if you spend 120 days out of 6 months in Europe and then the immigration authorities find out? And you spend this time in Europe not because you're an illegal immigrant. You came to Europe legally with all the visas and supporting documents, but the airlines that connect where you are to your home country, Vietnam, have closed flights because Vietnam suddenly said, you know what, no more traveling because we are coping with a very difficult situation. How do you go around that? Do you take a bus and drive all the way from Italy to to Vietnam? So, and this is due to the fact that that person in this example, the Vietnamese passport holder, is a holder of a passport that doesn't grant visa-free traveling to various countries, and of course, it is not a European Union passport. So how do we solve this conflict? Well, applying for residency permits in the Schengen area, and sometimes even applying for secondary passports. This is also quite an interesting topic, but it is reserved to relatively wealthy people because the entry level is roughly $150,000 per household to be paid up entirely upfront. You cannot pay in convenient installments, but I say up to millions. Of course, there still are programs in Europe, especially in Malta, even though it's been reduced and it's going to be phased out after what happened. We talked about Malta in the previous episode. There still is the passport program in Malta, which costs a good, likely 1.3, 1.5 million euros for application. But evidently, if you're Vietnamese and you have the money to spend on a European passport, like the Maltese one, that could indeed solve a number of problems.
Having said that, these are the experiences and takeaways, again, we take from 2021. We are facing 2022. And of course, I know that we cannot predict what future brings with other global threats that we might be facing. But maybe we can say what you already know that is going to happen in all the areas that you are operating within, and how this can change the perspective we are seeing things with in terms of travel restrictions, immigration, and conflicts resulting therefrom.
My personal view is that if it is established that the Omicron variant is not as aggressive in terms of symptoms as the previous variants, then there will be no need to lock down Europe. It is debate, I'm not a scientist, whether the milder effects of the Omicron variant are mild because they're mild full stop, or because people that contract the disease are already protected by the vaccines. So what would happen to these people that contract the disease if they were not vaccinated? Would they end up in ICU? That is probably too early to tell. But if we establish that Omicron is not that deadly, that lethal, my prediction is that within the European Union, there will not be lockdowns, at least in countries with very high vaccination rates like Malta. Malta is ranking probably number 2 in Europe after, I think, Portugal, in terms of percentage of the population that has been vaccinated. As for Asia, there could be lockdowns. So my worry is Vietnam, out of the 2 countries that I work with there in that part of the world. Why? Because Vietnam has scarcity of vaccines. So they did a fantastic and extraordinary job in vaccinating, I think at the time of speaking, about 80+% of the population. So it was remarkable. They did that in just a few months. However, in order to achieve this result, they had to resort to cocktails, as they're called. So you got one shot of Chinese manufactured vaccine and one shot of AstraZeneca, one shot of Pfizer, one shot of Moderna. Now, some scientists even argue that cocktails are actually better to protect the immune system because the immune system reacts differently and somehow gets trained. The problem is that this showed that the country was not prepared. They didn't have vaccines in stock. They relied heavily on Chinese vaccines. They relied heavily on donations from foreign countries like the US. Italy did a fantastic job in providing Vietnam with a number of doses of AstraZeneca. Let me be a bit proud about my country for once. But the problem is what happens when the effects of the second dose phase out. So will there be a need for, will they have in stock all the necessary doses for the third jab? We don't know. So that is my worry, and there could be indeed more severe restrictions. My provision is that with the looming breakouts that could be connected with the Lunar New Year, with Tet, the Chinese New Year, the country will remain closed to foreigners until then. Then once the local population have celebrated the New Year, the Lunar New Year, then they will try and open up gradually. Singapore will likely have a faster yet always prudent approach. And it also depends on international relations. For instance, Italy recently closed the borders to Singapore because Singapore was not meeting certain parameters. It was, I think, a mistake by Italy, but Singapore didn't take it well. So it also has to do with all these intricate politics. But this is the outtake. I hope, as I said, that there won't be any more lockdowns and that restrictions will be limited in time.
Thank you so much, Federico. And I hope so too, that there will not be any more lockdowns globally, especially when it's applied to countries that get hit particularly hard. So with that, we're wrapping up. We'll come back next week and do your next episode. Thank you so much for your thoughts and insights on traveling and immigration during this pandemic.
Thank you.